Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Blue Jays Today. We're your boys. We always got something to say about the Toronto Blue Jays. I'm your host, Adam Peddle.
And I'm your host, Nicholas Playlog. And today, everybody, we have a very special guest joining us. A real inspiration to us, man. Like the content, the coverage, just everything Toronto Blue Jays related. This guy's an expert. And we are so happy to invite him back onto the show for the second time. Mr. Shi Davidi, welcome in, sir. Thank you so much for joining us once again.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me back.
Yeah, thank you for being here, Shi. I mean, a lot of stuff has been going down in the last couple weeks of the Blue Jays offseason. The first, chunk of that Blue Jays offseason, I think we can all agree, was very underwhelming. Not a lot going on. A lot of people have kind of been not too happy with how it's going, but I can confidently say that things are starting to change, and hopefully some more things are coming. And I can't wait to pick your brain on what could be coming up next for the Toronto Blue Jays, Shi.
Yeah, it's been a very interesting offseason in a number of different ways. Obviously, an emotional one for the fan base with a couple high-profile pursuits that didn't end up going the Jays' way. The addition of Anthony Santander has the potential to be a significant difference maker for the lineup, and Andres Gimenez is going to be super exciting to watch defensively. And if that back comes around, then we're having a very different conversation about that trade in a few months. So a lot of interesting pieces, a lot of interesting behind the scenes stuff as well. The changes obviously with Mark Tremuta taking over as scouting director, and that is low key one of the more important areas for this team to improve upon if they're going to be able to extend this competitive window moving forward. There's some changes to minor league pitching development. Eric Lear coming over from the San Francisco Giants and taking over as the first director of pitching on the minor league side that the Blue Jays have ever had. So those are some really beneath the surface changes that have a chance to be really significant for the franchise moving forward. And like you guys said, we'll see what the rest of the offseason throws up at this team as well.
Well, yeah, I love that you listed out, this is what I mean, guys. By an expert, we're talking expert right here. Shi Davidi just gave us all of the transactions that transpired in the Blue Jays offseason. But I love that you did that because, a lot of people, I think, I don't want to call out the surface level casual fan here, but it's like, oh, well, you miss out on Juan Soto, so we didn't do enough. We didn't fulfill our, the goals this off season. But really, going through all of the moves, all the transactions, there has been a lot of moving parts here, right? On the coaching staff, in the lineup as well. I guess let's just start off with where we're at right now. Would you say that this is what you expected to see from the Toronto Blue Jays this offseason? Or was there anything that really caught you off guard, really surprised you? And is there anything that you still expect to see from them with the, couple weeks left that we have before spring training, before pitchers and catchers reporting?
I mean, it's really interesting because in some ways, it's a lot of the things that I think the Blue Jays talked about wanting to accomplish this offseason. The one piece that still hasn't happened, and my guess is that we'll see happen in some way, shape, or form, is some type of addition to the pitching staff with an opportunity to impact from a starting perspective. Obviously, they've attacked the bullpen and made some significant moves there, highlighted by Jeff Hoffman and Jimmy Garcia. But I also, I guess, in terms of what surprises me, there's two things, right? Andres Gimenez, to me, it's a fascinating transaction on for a number of reasons, but it's also a massive bet because the Jays are assuming about $96 million of his contract. It's one of the biggest outlays to a player in franchise history, and if the bat doesn't rebound, then it doesn't address sort of their core need. It obviously is going to help them, help their pitching staff. It is definitely going to make their pitchers better. It's going to save a lot of runs. But this team was pretty decent defensively last year. They needed offense, and if Gimenez can't give them any offense, then that doesn't really impact them as fully as they would like it to. And so I think maybe taking a risk in that way was somewhat surprising to me. I guess the other thing too is that when you put it all together, the Blue Jays have spent a bit more than, at least based on the conversations that I was having at the beginning of the offseason, they maybe have spent a bit more or beyond where I expected them to be. And I think
Yeah.
part of that is they were able to get Santander and Hoffman on pretty good numbers. And maybe that was what allowed them to do so. But I think, at least based on the discussions that I had at the beginning of the winter, I wouldn't have thought that they would be a team pushing up towards the second CBT threshold.
Right. And Shai, like, to begin this offseason, I was thinking too, when I heard that press conference from Ross and Mark, and they were like what you're referencing right now, they were kind of talking about spending the similar amounts like they did back last season. But I always thought to myself, well, and you could comment on this as well, I didn't think that'd be enough for really to put a competitive team out there for one last year. Like we're talking about, they were last in WAR in terms of Fangraph WAR in the bullpen in the entire MLB, right? That's you're asking quite a lot. You're asking for trades like they did, dude, signing of Jeff Hoffman, dumping off Jordan Romano, getting Nick Sandlin in a trade. Like they've done a pretty good job repairing that bullpen, but then you also got to look at the home run numbers and how we've seen how that's impacted the team or impacted MLB in the postseason. Home runs have really become the name of the game, and how we needed to add some more power bats. So then when you do all the math, did you kind of expect them to be spending this? I know you kind of said that you didn't really expect them to spend that much, but like, is it really shocking? Like, do you think they could have done it in other ways to be competitive without spending as much money?
I think it comes down to how much. And let's, I don't want to overly complicate this, but there's also a bit of a gap between their cash payroll and their CBT payroll, right? So like for the CBT purposes, salaries are averaged out over the duration of the contract, whereas on a yearly basis, the amount of money you might pay somebody may fluctuate. And so, Jimenez's money is backloaded a little bit. So, he's not as expensive now as he's going to be over the next 3 years. And so I guess so I'll start with that. But then the other thing is, like, they were never going to be able to do everything or it was going to be very difficult for them to accomplish everything that they wanted within sort of the rough parameters with what they already had in place, right? Because you were trying to address whole things. You mentioned the bullpen, and it was like a 7.5 win swing from the bullpen in 2023. Right? Like that's completely crazy. They were, I think the Rockies were the second worst bullpen in WAR as calculated by Fangraphs, and they were the only one that was like, Blue Jays were the only ones that were in the negatives, or maybe the Rockies were a slight negative, but the Blue Jays were minus 2.5 wins. Like that is a jarring number, right? So that was going to correct, and so they had some aberrations. But then you think about all the things that they wanted to address, like. It's tough to buy all that, and it's tough to trade from all that when you don't have the farm system. Like the Red Sox have a deep farm system. They needed an ace. They weren't comfortable going to paying Corbin Burns or Max Fried what they ended up getting, so they traded for Garrett Crochet, right? The Blue Jays don't have the farm system to be able to trade for a Garrett Crochet right now. They can't make that kind of deal. They can make the kind of deal where they use some surplus and take back money, which is what they did with Jimenez, and in a different degree what they did with Miles Straw. But the real sort of team trying to reset and then send prospects for a now player, that one isn't quite as available to them. So I think when you can take a step back and you put all those pieces together, you can understand why this offseason has played out the way it is. And they took some big swings to see what happened. Obviously, they didn't connect on them. There's no downside in that, except for the frustration of your fan base, which, can be easily understood. And so, I don't know, in some ways, this offseason, if I look at it and think about it through those lenses, it makes sense. But then just the way it played out, it's maybe sometimes harder to kind of see the forest from the trees.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, man. And like, obviously too, there have been times where it has been very frustrating, where, it's felt like I was even bringing up, prior to the Anthony Santander signing, I was like, is this team cursed? Like, can we ever get across the fit? Like, who wants the money? Does somebody want to take the Toronto Blue Jays money? And eventually, of course, it did happen with Anthony Santander, which, I mean, I love. I think it's going to be great, work wonders for this lineup. I really, really do. And I love the contract that, or what the money, or what they got him on, excuse me, is all across the board, phenomenal. You brought up in that whole spiel right there, them going out and taking some big swings. Somebody who also takes a lot of big swings is Mr. Pete Alonso, and I wanted to bring him up because that has been the major talking point, I think, around Toronto Blue Jays land for a little while right now. Directly after the Anthony Santander signing happened, you had a couple people come out and say, hey, Toronto Blue Jays, they're not done. There are still potentially more moves for them to make on the table. And then, the rumor mill, you know how it goes. It starts churning. And a couple days after that, Pete Alonso's name gets thrown into it. And before you know it, it feels like we're, tracking planes on a Thursday afternoon, except this time it's Pete Alonso. Can you walk us through a little bit about just that whole situation right now surrounding Pete Alonso, how you see it? I know that you and Ben Nicholson-Smith poured some cold water on those rumors. Do you still feel like it's a relatively big long shot for him to come here? And just overall, what do you think about Mr. Polar Bear Pete?
Okay, so let's start with Ben and I did not personally pour the cold water, right? It's the people that we're talking to,
right?
Yes.
And I feel pretty good about where we got that information from at the time, and so I don't want it to be like, oh, we're the ones who are trying to
don't shoot the messenger.
Yeah,
don't shoot the messenger.
Shai,
yeah,
why don't you want people to come here, man?
That's
come
right.
on.
It's it. Look, there's a lot in what you asked. So let's just kind of start here. Like, the Blue Jays have had an interest in Pete Alonso, and there has been work that happened behind the scenes, right? And this I've heard from multiple places, and obviously there's going to be some degree of discussion. Pete Alonso is a client of Scott Boras. Scott Boras really controlled the market. The Blue Jays would have been in touch with him throughout the offseason and will continue to be in touch with him because he still has players available, right? So let's put that out there. Now, the fact that, so one thing I don't know for sure from a timeline perspective, and this is my guess, and I'm just speculating here, but I wonder if the Blue Jays were negotiating concurrently with Santander and Alonso, and one of them was going to get a deal, right? They had a deal for one of them. They're like, do you want this Santander? Do you want this Alonso? Do you want this? Do you want this? They go back and forth. Eventually, Santander takes the deal, right? And now, and again, I'm still speculating here, but the Blue Jays are just under the second CBT threshold. At the news conference afterwards, Ross Atkins, when talking about other additions, said, we'll examine what's out there. When there's something real, we'll present that to ownership. And to me, that sounded like executive code for, the Blue Jays are kind of at their spending limit and they'd need special permission to add anything else. It doesn't mean that they can't or won't if the deal was right. But I don't think at that point that's telling you that something's active and they can just go out and make it happen without getting a permission. So I think that's sort of what's going on there. And, the other piece to it is, so the Blue Jays are suddenly progressing in talks with Pete Alonso and things of that nature. I mean, this is a negotiation that has been between Pete Alonso and the Mets. That is a very significant media market. If somebody wanted to try and leverage public pressure, New York is certainly the market in which to make it happen. And there is certainly that reason to believe that some of the leaks that came out were intended to try and get the Mets to move. You are, I'm sure, heard the comments that the owner Steve Cohen made at the Mets fan event over the weekend, in terms of him being exhausted and how drawn out the process has been. So I really think that there is a significant degree of this is a made in New York kind of event, and the Blue Jays are getting caught up in it. It doesn't mean that they haven't had an interest or don't have an interest, but I think you can certainly look at it and say, all right, the Blue Jays are probably in a wait and see opportunistic mode right now. And I don't know that they're necessarily pushing or driving negotiations as currently, at least currently in this moment.
Okay. So would you say then maybe they're more likely going to be talking about maybe with some free agents, or talking about starting pitching free agents right now, they're going to be more likely to be negotiating there? Because I know that was a little bit of a priority that people have been speculating on, that if they are going to spend a little bit more, then it might be on the starting pitching market. Do you think it's more likely they go spend their money there than adding another big bat like Pete Alonso for a short-term deal?
I think that that's the piece of all the things that they wanted to accomplish over the offseason. That's the one that they haven't yet, right? They've on the minor league free agent side, they got Eric Lauer, they brought back Adam Kloffenstein. Those are a couple depth guys, but I don't think that's what the Blue Jays were really looking for going into this offseason. I still wonder, does Ryan Yarbrough, that type of pitcher, someone who can give you some starts, who can give you some work out of the bullpen, just give you some length. He protects you in any number of different ways. I'm not sure what Ross Stripling's plans are, but someone like him too, like that type of pitcher who can swing back and forth between roles, that makes some sense for me. The Blue Jays have had some discussions up the market. They have looked at Max Scherzer. They have looked at Nick Pivetta. They have looked at Flaherty. I don't know how active any of those are right now. But I think that is sort of where, if you're going to push right now, that I can see the Blue Jays certainly wanting to address that more. But, I think in a vacuum, if you look at it, be like, okay, you put Pete Alonso into this lineup. Okay, well, that really plays, right?
Right.
Now you can line up in whatever order, Bo, Guerrero, Santander, and Alonso. That's a gauntlet for an opposing pitcher to navigate. But again, I think that if the Blue Jays could have done all this stuff, they would have.
Right.
And so, I think that they're right now, they're trying to figure out where can they get the best impact for the buck with whatever budget is they have remaining.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it was always going to be a long shot, but let's assume for argument's sake, they don't get Pete Alonso, probably not going to happen anyway. So they don't get Pete Alonso. That leaves us with a first baseman right now, who is a very good first baseman, who has got only 1 year left on his deal, and who, from my understanding, has given a deadline that is, quick math here, 18 days from now, to get his extension done, something along those lines. Can you walk us through right now just your overall thoughts on the whole Vladimir Guerrero Jr. extension conversations? Have you heard anything? Like, are those talks gonna start, hopefully, progressing as we get closer to that deadline? And ultimately, in your opinion, Shi Davidi, do you see them actively or actually getting an extension done before February 18th?
Okay, so let's start here. So I expect there to be one last push between the sides. I don't know if it's started yet or not, but given the way the baseball industry loves deadline and needs something to some sort of push there to force them to lay their cards on the table, I'd expect this to probably end closer to the 17th, one way or the other. In terms of what happens, like, I don't think this is overly complicated, right? I think Vladimir Guerrero Jr., at least based on the comments that he made in that interview with the Spanish language podcast that he made in December, like, he's got a number in mind. The Blue Jays haven't come close to it yet. The Blue Jays, I'm sure, have an idea of that number, what that number is. And can the Blue Jays get close enough to that number to make Vladimir Guerrero Jr. think about it if they don't want to just outright meet it? And that is really where things are at. So my guess, and I don't know this, but this is what I would expect, is that the Blue Jays would at some point put forth what they feel is their best offer, their best attempt to try and get Vladimir Guerrero Jr. close enough to what he wants to satisfy him. And then Guerrero would have to make a decision. Okay, is this enough? Do I want this, or do I want to test my fortunes in free agency and see where that goes? And I'll tell you that the Juan Soto contract has, at least in the mind of certain players, really changed what the potential is. And I think you can look at him, you can look at Aaron Judge, and you can look at the benefits that they had by rejecting extensions from their clubs and then going to the market. They both made significantly more by pushing them to free agency. So I think that is ultimately, those are all the dynamics that are in play right now. The Blue Jays obviously have to decide, okay, this is the cornerstone that we want to lay for the next decade plus, and it's going to be by far the most significant contract in franchise history. In some ways, no matter what happens, this is really going to be the contract that defines the reigns of Mark Shapiro and Ross Atkins, because they are either the guys that extended Guerrero or the guys who let him walk. So one way or traded him, depending on what might happen at the deadline. But I think that this is those in a nutshell are the stakes. And in terms of what I think happens, I personally think that there's a pathway to a deal here. It's going to be uncomfortable. The Blue Jays are going to have to go to a place that's uncomfortable for them. Guerrero's going to probably have to give up a little bit of upside that makes it a little bit uncomfortable for him. But there's a middle point that I think probably works for both sides. Can they get there? We're going to find out.
You started off that whole thing speaking on, I guess, what he's got a number, the Blue Jays have a number, everything like that. Actually, I think it was a month ago or a couple months ago, we heard that they were roughly like $100 million apart. Do you have any idea as to, what those numbers kind of look like? Or have you just heard we're far?
Yeah, I think that obviously there are the numbers that Vladimir Guerrero Jr. put out there in that interview. And then there's some other numbers that have circulated since. And I would just be careful, because it's hard to be 100% what happens between two sides. And obviously both of them can't really, there are rules against leaking information, specific information. So we can kind of gauge some hints. I think clearly there is a gap, but I don't think at this point that the sides cannot understand one another. I mean, they've had multiple goes at this, right? They've been together for years now. There shouldn't be any secrets at this point. So to me, ultimately, it comes down to, can they find a middle ground? And I think that middle ground is probably reachable. Again, it's going to involve some discomfort from both sides. It's certainly will be, anytime you're committing that much money to one player, there's going to be some risk involved. It'd be a degree of risk that this franchise hasn't gone to before. From an extension standpoint, you're really only looking at Vernon Wells and the $126 million 7-year deal that he did, which obviously did not turn out the way that the franchise had hoped it would have. Is that going to be rewritten now? I don't know. I think the opportunity is there. Vladimir Guerrero Jr. has been clear on multiple occasions that he wants to stay here longer term. And then it becomes down to a business decision for both sides.
Well, I wanted to actually address that exact right there, because yes, it's a business decision, and I know that in the past we've kind of heard that this front office they really do calculate players' values and numbers and how much they think they're worth. But I like what you brought up a little bit earlier about how Ross Atkins, Mark Shapiro, their 10 years are coming to an end in a couple years. Does that play a factor in all this, knowing how much Vladdy does mean to this fan base and what is at stake? Do you think that there's like a hidden number there that we're like, okay, well, we're trying to get as close as possible, but there's this contingency number where if we can't do it, we just gotta put that number on the table, because at the end of the day, we need to extend Guerrero. We need to keep this cornerstone of our franchise still here. Is there any sort of thing on that you think at play here?
Well, I think I think you're looking at it and that description there, understandably, that's more of a fan perspective on it, right? And I
For
think
sure.
from a club perspective would be, okay, well, how are we, if we're putting this in place, how are we leveraging this? What value are we going to get back? Are we going to be able to build around him and be able to take advantage of what that does? And what does this mean for us as a business in terms of how much revenue it helps us generate, right?
Right. Right.
So, and I think those discussions sometimes align, but sometimes they don't, right? Because there's the emotion of it. If Vladimir Guerrero Jr. This was to be his final season and there's no extension and he walks or whatever the case is, like that would be gutting emotionally. But I
Mm,
think from and certainly it's damaging potentially to the business
Right.
if that money can't be reallocated in a significant and impactful way. But the other element I think that the club would view it as is like, well, are we in position to take advantage of that? Or are we spending this money into the abyss? Like, are we turning him into Todd Helton North, where, a player has, monster season after monster season, but there isn't a good enough team around him. So it just disappears into the ether, right? I think that's sort of um, how a front office would evaluate it a little bit more. So I yes, like this is going to define them or follow them a lot of ways, and will be really a defining transaction, whichever way it ends up playing out. But I don't think they would look at it with like we want to appease the fans. It's can we turn this into a good business decision and into a good baseball decision? And if they can't do both of those, then I can't see them saying, okay, well, we'll just do this to make the fans happy if they don't have conviction and a plan for that transaction.
right.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly hear everything that you're saying. I guess I was instilled with a lot of confidence after the Anthony Santander signing because it felt to me like, well, to make extending Guerrero a better business decision for us, something that we can get behind. And you were bringing up the idea. It's like, well, we got to have a team around him if we're going to
Mm.
pay him this amount of money. It felt to me like the Anthony Santander move, as much as it is good right now, and should help the team in 2025 and hopefully for several years after that. It also felt kind of connected a little way to potentially extending Vladdy. Am I making a reach here, or do you think that there's something to that? Whoa, time for a quick shout out to the sponsor of this video. Hit your picks and knock it out of the park with Betway. Scan the QR code down below to join the action. Only available in Ontario. Must be 19 years of older to participate. Please play responsibly. Now, everyone, back to the content.
I think there's a little bit of column A there for sure, but there's also some column B. Like that deal could potentially be as short as 3 years if he
Mm,
chooses to opt out. And the number with the deferrals is so manageable that if you had to trade him in a couple of years' time because you were embarking on some sort of reset, you could,
mm,
right? And like let's zoom out a little bit. And it's not just Vladdy who's up; it's Bo Bichette who's also up, and that's another cornerstone player. And then Chris Bassett, who's also up at the end of this season. And then you've also got George Springer and Kevin Gosman, who are coming up soon as well after 26. There's some bullpen pieces that are going to come and go. So a lot of money will be coming off the books, but you don't necessarily have enough of the internal pieces to replace and replenish at the degree and with the impact that you'd need, right? Like, maybe Orelvis Martinez is going to be a great offensive player. Alan Roden is super interesting and he could be a really nice piece. But is one of those guys going to be like an 850, 875 OPS player? Is one of those guys going to be a three to four win player? And if so, when, right? And then where are they going to get the starting pitching from? So Manoah is going to come back, but Ricky Tiedemann is going to be a while. They don't have a ton of near term pitching, or at least that's sort of ready to jump in and help carry a load. There are a lot of holes that are beyond just Anthony Santander that are
mm.
going to come up, and that again, much like this offseason, you won't necessarily be able to just solely fill with money. And I think that is the longer term challenge for this franchise. And for the sake of argument, let's say there's a $40 million AAV for Vladimir Guerrero Jr. I mean, is that a fifth of your payroll? And how are you using 4/5 of your payroll beyond that to build around him and supplement? So I think sort of when you go to 10,000 feet, that's the wider view that,
Mhm.
it's not just about extending Vladimir Guerrero Jr. It's also about what are you doing in 26 and 27 and 28, like the peak years where you're going to extract the most value from an extension. How are you making sure that that isn't being wasted?
So what you're saying is we're in a pickle. We're-
Succinctly, yes. As Ned Flanders would say on The Simpsons, a dilly of a pickle in this case, for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah. No, I mean, I think again, like we always hope that things can always happen and things can progress in a great way and things can these deals can get done and we can watch our favorite players. But you're right, like at the end of the day, baseball's a business and things might go turning a different direction than we'd hope for. But with all that being said, I wanted to ask you, Shi, your opinion for 2025, because for me, to a lesser extent, I hate to use this analogy, but this feels like the final dance. You know what I mean? Michael Jordan final dance with Bo and Vlad, right? So if this is the final dance, I think the Blue Jays are going to try to be competitive. Do you see them being competitive right now with this roster? And if not, what needs to happen to get them over that edge to maybe compete for a wild card or even the division?
So one thing I've spent some time thinking about the last few days, especially post Santander, is how are all these pieces going to fit together, right? Like, uh, how does this work, and how do you get to a different outcome? And I still, like many people, I still look at the lineup and I'm like, is there enough home run? Are there enough home runs in this lineup? Are they going to be able to out hit some of their issues? Because it's tough. Like I think they're going to be able. They're going to be among the stingiest defensive teams in the major leagues. I think that pretty much is clear.
Yeah.
They've got, especially once Dalton Varsho comes back, and then with Jimenez at second, Ernie Clement doing a bunch of work at third, Kirk behind the plate. I mean, that's a pretty strong defensive alignment. That's going to help their pitching staff. The bullpen can't be as bad as it was last year. Like that can't happen 2 years in a row. I think it'd be remarkable. I think if you go back and it's been a while since you've had like a -2.5 win bullpen.
Yeah.
So even if there, that if there's 2-3 win improvement there, I mean, that's an immediate gain. And then, the some of the publicly available projections, they seem to at least think that this Blue Jay team is in the mid 80s, right? And if you're in the mid 80s in wins, then you're in that conversation. I think the Blue Jays would like to find a way to, if they felt, I think that if they could add another starting pitcher, they feel like that's a double gain, because then you've got Yariel Rodriguez in that sort of swing role.
Yeah.
And that's just sort of adding wins to your roster without really sacrificing or taking away somebody else's playing time, who's going to be a difference maker for you. But I still can't shake the fact that, it feels like they need another 20 to 25 home run guy in there somewhere, right? And that's why I think the Pete Alonso discussion just keeps living on. As long as he's out there, it's just what a difference that makes in that lineup, right?
Yeah.
And it's not that there are other elements to it that aren't measurable in terms of what it does to the opposing pitcher on the mound, knowing that he's got that gauntlet of home run hitters to work through, and what it does for the opposing manager. And it's really hard to measure that. I know there are some people who believe that some of that stuff is overstated, and that you can make the case for that, but it's not nothing. And I think the Blue Jays missed that thumb, right? Like when they were who they were 21, 22, even to a lesser extent in 23, they were a team that could bang, right? And they were going to get you. And, if you let up, if you were on the mound and you weren't on your game, you were going to pay for it. And that hasn't been the case the past couple of seasons in the same way. And if the Blue Jays can get back a little bit more to that, then all of a sudden it makes everything else play up, and it takes some of the heat off their pitchers. And it means, like, if you make an error, it doesn't cost you the game and things like that. So that's how I look at this team. Like it is better. It is clearly better than it was a year ago. It is clearly deeper than it was a year ago. But will all that add up? Are they going to have to optimize every at bat situation and be constantly making moves? And is John Schneider going to have to manage with his hair on fire? I don't know. Like that could be one potential pathway for this team, but it's a tough way to navigate it, and it's a tough way to do that for 162 games. So they're going to be an interesting team, and then you throw in the stakes that you guys mentioned, the last dance, and that's going to be a real factor there too.
Well, the good news is that if Guerrero doesn't get an extension, it'll be a contract year, and he'll just have to hit 70 home runs. So that should be fine. Final question before we let you go, man. Spring training on the way. Who's somebody that you're looking out for and that you think the fans should be keeping an eye on, or just in general, what is something that the fans should be looking out for in spring training?
There's so much, right? And the amount of sort of on the cusp, AAA graduate to the big leagues types of players, be like a Leo Jimenez or a Joey Loperfido or Jonathan Clase, Jake Bloss, some guys who are sort of around, or Ralvis Martinez. What's he going to be? That to me, like if someone emerges from there, assuming they don't sign another bat, if someone emerges from that group, Addison Barger at third base, maybe if someone emerges from that group and is able to give this lineup a bit of punch, or one other bat that does some damage, that's a whole that really can change the outlook on the season. Now, will that happen? I don't know, obviously. But just the Blue Jays have a group of players now that could potentially give them a boost. And that didn't exist in quite the same way last year. And that is the quote unquote silver lining from having to have a deadline sell off to the degree that they did a year ago, is that they really added some pieces to their farm system. They have some options of guys that they can move back and forth that they didn't beforehand. And so to me, that's kind of going to be important to watch in spring training. Like, has there been progress from those guys? Is someone ready to make a move and grab some more playing time, force their way into it? I didn't mention Will Wagner. He's got a chance to, at least as presently constituted, get a good number of at bats in the DH spot, and moving around a couple of defensive positions. So those are all players who could factor in some way, and just the degree to which they could factor, I think it will start getting a early sense in spring training.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Hey, I mean, anything could happen, man. That's baseball. You come in with one idea of what your team is, and it could be completely different, but that's why we watch. Shi, thank you so much for coming in today and talking to us about the Blue Jays offseason and the future of this team. Obviously, we're in a pickle, and there's a lot of scary stuff coming ahead, but I'm sure we're all going to be fine, and we're going to enjoy some baseball this year, and it's going to be a fun ride. Thank you for coming in here, Shi.
I appreciate it, and look, it's better to have interesting times than dull times, and there definitely going to be some interesting days ahead.
Exactly, man.
Yeah.
Could you imagine if we were the LA Dodgers? How boring is that?
Boo.
How boring is it? It's just same, another season, another championship. That's boring,
That might not have been my example. Maybe I think you don't want to be the Chicago White Sox, say. I think we'd all like to slum it like the Dodgers once in a while, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, could use a day or two in their shoes. But again, thank you so much, man. We'll watch for your reports and all your coverage during spring training a bunch, dude. Everybody, that was Shi Davidi. Again, you can find him everywhere because the guy knows his Blue Jays stuff. So please let us know your thoughts about everything we talked about in this podcast down below. Hit that like, smash the subscribe button. $3 a month, become a Patreon member. Shout out and thank you to all of our current Patreon members and our YouTube members. You guys are the best.
Guys, thank you so much for watching.
And as always,
go Jays, go!